Welcome to another episode of What's at Stake, a Penta podcast. I'm your host, Bryan DeAngelis, a partner here at Penta Group, and I'm joined today by some of my colleagues from Penta's intelligence team. Emily Vaughan, Senior Director of Client Services, Natalie Bahmanyar, Associate Director of Policy Insiders, and Sehare Hemani, Director of Research. Thank you all for joining this week.
Happy to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
We're going to talk today, take a little dive into the newest edition of the Washington Insights Review. This is our annual report based on hundreds of conversations we have with policymakers, especially in the federal government, but kind of across the globe, which we'll talk about a little bit. And it highlights the top policy priorities, provides some key insights into the advocacy landscape here in DC. So Emily, Natalie, and Sehare is going to help us kind of dig into all of this, and let's jump right into it. So as I was saying, we literally do hundreds of conversations with policymakers each year. We've been doing this for about 10 years. Can you help break this down a little bit more? Who do you guys talk to? How do you gather the data on policymaker priorities? Maybe Sehare, I'll start with you.
Sure. Yeah. Let me break it down with audience and methodology separately. So when we're thinking about the audience for this research, right, it really comes back to who does our client care about? Who do they want to hear from? Whose perspective is going to have some business implications or decisions that they can make? So that scope really varies from a pretty local state level to a federal level to outside of the US and into the EU, UK, and beyond. But typically the folks that we're speaking to are going to be folks that are pretty senior on the Hill in agencies. That those are people like chief of staffs, ledge directors, policy advisors. In the EU, that's folks in the parliament or the commission or member states even. And then on state projects, it's again pretty localized. So we're still dipping into ledge executive agencies, but also municipal and hearing from folks at hyper-local levels, if that's of interest to our clients. In terms of sample, we do a pretty good job of getting representation, right? And ensuring we have things that matter like demographics, policy, or party affiliation, things of that nature. But what I think is pretty cool in terms of what Penta does and how we approach this is our ability to tap into some really niche audience needs that our clients have. Let me give you an example from this past cohort of research. We chose to do a little bit more of a focus on PACs in our federal research. And because of that, we needed to tap into individuals that took the No PAC pledge, which is a pretty small universe when you think about the relative population, right? And we have an extraordinary talent at Penta to tap into those niche audiences and get their perspective on subjects that are pretty focused.
Let me just follow up quickly. So what makes policymakers choose to participate in this research? We go out and recruit them, but why are they interested in engaging?
Yeah, it's a question we ask in the interviews as well. Like, why are you talking to us and why are you giving us this valuable time of yours, right? I think it falls into three buckets. One, they get the reciprocal nature of the work that we do, both from a strategy level and a tactical level. What they're sharing with us, what they tell us is important to them, ends up on the advocacy agendas of our clients and how private organizations set those agendas. Also, it changes how those organizations show up to conversations with policymakers and how they choose to develop that relationship over a longer period of time and what they come into that conversation with. The other thing that we hear, of course, is the content that's being developed and reciprocated back to policymakers. It's really helpful for them to have that perspective of how does their perspective fit into the larger narrative that's taking place on the Hill or at agencies. And then lastly, and this is my favorite, policymakers are nerds. And I think all of us in this room can really appreciate that fact, right? Definitely. They absolutely are invested in creating an impact. And on the research end, the researchers do a really good job of finding out what matters to these individuals before we get on the phone and having a custom agenda and really picking topics that they care about.
As a former Hill staffer, I take that as a badge of honor.
I appreciate it.
Definitely
It was meant to be so.
And it was helpful to participate in kind of your previous research when I was up there and a lot of this work to exactly your points. You get, a better sense of what those corporations are coming up to the hill with. You get a chance to say what you're looking for in some of the data that comes out of that. So, and Natalie, this is a little bit of your work too.
Mm-hmm.
Like we bring these folks in and it's not just a one-time thing. They become part of what we call Penta Policy Insiders.
Mm-hmm.
How does that fit into the kind of broader picture here?
Yeah, so that's the name that we kind of gave the community of people who participate in both our qualitative and our quantitative research. To kind of echo what Sehare said, it's the policymakers, the senior policy staff, the senior officials that we talk to across the board, both domestically, globally, and it's the folks that can really speak to the different dynamics that are happening on the political landscape. So that the website and that community sort of houses those people and also the content that Sehare mentioned that comes out of the work that we do that goes back to the policymakers. So, it gives them sort of a designated space where they can see that content, where they can find the pieces that they might be interested in, both based on where they're from and, what they might be interested in. And it also gives them that unique perspective back to them about like what their peers are thinking about certain policy issues and the stuff that is important to them.
And Emily, let me bring you into this. So we think about those policy insiders, but what other capabilities does Penta have to inform stakeholders also on the kind of state level and the global level as well?
Yeah, we work with a number of organizations. I mean, if you're a corporation operating and kind of on the radar of policymakers in Washington, you are cared about the policymakers in your home state where your headquarters is. You probably are working on a global scale. You care about what's happening in the EU and other places that are sort of driving a lot of these regulatory conversations. So yeah, as Sehare mentioned, we work with organizations to help them understand like what's happening in DC, what's happening in their delegation in DC. So if you're from California, what's happening in Alex Padilla's office, what's happening in, Katie Porter's office. And then similarly, like what's happening down at the state level, especially California is a particularly interesting one because I always say like what California is to America, America is to the world. It's sort of a little bit ahead, a little bit kind of pushing the conversation.
Exactly.
And so kind of helping them understand like what's the landscape there, and how does this differ and how do you kind of tailor what you're doing and what the needs are of these different levels. And even as far down as Sehare mentioned to like local communities, like what does the mayor or the city council or, the health board, if you're a healthcare organization, think about your action and the action of your members or the action of what you're doing in communities where you are actually present.
Yeah. And a lot of what we do here at Penta, we talk about, helping clients kind of strengthen their decision-making, get a better understanding of stakeholders. And this is one piece in that puzzle. And talk a little bit about how that fits in with some of the other work we do on media intelligence and reputation intelligence.
Yeah, I think one thing we talk about at Penta all the time is the idea that there are lots of different stakeholder groups that have lots of different opinions and lots of different incentives and motivations. And if you are a company or an association representing companies, you need to sort of meet all of those needs and understand all of them. Like your employees might be asking for something that will perhaps run afoul of one party in Washington, or what you're doing at the state level and what's demanded of you in California might create challenges with what's happening in the EU. And so I think the way that we think about it is we want to help the organizations we work with understand like how to balance those two things and thread the needle. So understand what do your investors want? What do they expect of you? What do your employees want? What do policymakers want? And help them understand who of those stakeholder groups are the most germane to what you're doing, and how do you balance the needs of all of them? I focus mostly on the policymaker side of stuff, which is its own internal, like you're saying, like your stakeholder groups within policymakers are different.
Right.
What Democrats want is often not what Republicans want. Shocker. But it's so a lot of what we're doing here is helping companies at least understand the landscape so they can make really informed decisions.
Yeah, that's great.
The one thing I'd add to Emily's perspective there too is that we have a pretty robust quantitative metrics that we supply our clients with. And what's really interesting about the interplay of the quant and qualitative research that we do at the federal level is you get that robust data set, and then qual helps clients understand the story behind the numbers.
That's a great point.
It brings to the forefront how those perspectives are being formed and what's informing those perspectives. Qual helps tell the story behind those metrics and brings to the forefront how those perspectives are really being formed, and in scenarios where that isn't a great perspective, what it's going to take to change that for policymakers. So that interplay between the two methodologies is really interesting.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Let's dive a little bit into what you guys are seeing this year. So what are some of the emerging issues that came up as sort of top priorities for policymakers?
Yeah, so it was really interesting because I think it was one of the times that we saw a pretty uniform alignment between policymakers and like what was on their mind and what was on the mind of the general public. Tech, and particularly AI, ended up being like a really prominent theme for policymakers this year. Really just sort of in every aspect that you can think of, AI was something that they were talking about, whether it came to the upcoming elections or whether it came to like its use in their day-to-day lives. AI and cybersecurity were like the two big things that kind of had a through line through everything they were talking about.
Not a huge surprise, maybe per se, because AI is everywhere. But how informed would you say policymakers are on artificial intelligence and I guess even other emerging technologies?
Yeah, so it was really interesting to hear their perspectives on it and the fact that they are actually like actively desperate for information on it. It's not something that they feel like they know enough about, especially given how rapidly it's evolving. There's a lot of questions about, just what is it? What is AI? How do you define it? And that leads to questions of how do you regulate it? But if you can't define it, you can't regulate it. So you have a lot of commentary on even people who are in offices that may inherently be like suspicious of working with big industries and big companies. They're looking to those experts in order to get some clarity on what it is, where it's going, so that they can make more informed decisions around it. And I think it's really interesting because like we also in the Washington Insights Review, when we covered this section, we ourselves tried to map out like a definition of AI for them, and like we ran into a struggle because there's also so many different sources and like even in the community people define it differently. There are some key kind of tenets that most people can agree on, but we were trying to give something back to them that was like, here, this is what it is. And like, we actually can't do it either. So no wonder they're confused, So that was it was really interesting to hear that. And it was a very prominent theme that they want more information and they want more clarity. And they're hoping that industry can help them with that.
Yeah, this is often a big challenge in Washington, right?
Yeah.
Everything gets lumped into a broad bucket where it's AI or it's crypto or it's tech, but there's, as we've talked a lot about on the podcast and other places, like there's a lot of pieces of
a lot
AI,
of rapidly moving pieces.
Right, that are rapidly changing. So that makes regulating AI pretty complex. Like how can the technology industry really help policymakers kind of sort through this?
Yeah, no, I think that makes a ton of sense. Even to build on what Natalie said, one interesting thing that we've heard from policymakers, not just this year, but in prior years, is that there's a lot of concern about the knowledge on the Hill in particular around tech and emerging technologies. By its nature, business and tech moves faster than policy. People who've been out of the private sector for a long time, have been specializing in other things, don't necessarily understand it. And we've heard a lot about the brain drain in the tech space from the Hill, as sometimes they're not people who have that kind of knowledge and expertise are moving on and doing other things with their careers and not necessarily, it's not being replaced with someone who is now an AI expert, which makes regulating really hard because one of the challenges is that policymakers not only don't necessarily know how to wrap their arms around the breadth of something like AI, which, like you said, Brian, is this wildly amorphous, could be anything. But they also don't necessarily have the expertise to have those through lines of what is your regulatory action going to do to the industry writ large, to other industries. What are these sort of knock-on effects? One really good example, which I'm going to cite the EU because this is a place that happened before, but the Cyber Resilience Act that was passed in the EU in 2023, or it was not passed. I guess it was sort of up for debate. It was the EU process is complicated, but the way that it was structured required a level of reporting out that made the concept of open source technology almost impossible to be included in any kind of technological regulation. And that was not the intent. The intent of the Cyber Resilience Act is looking at a place like Ukraine and saying we have to protect against cyber attacks. We're looking at a place like these sort of geopolitical things. And the regulatory scheme they came up with actually made it such that, most of the internet's built on open source and most code is built on open source. And there was concern that maybe you would just have to erase all of that. It would not be possible to kind of source that back in the EU. And I think that's the piece of the regulatory side that's really hard, is that it's going to be hard no matter what, but because the expertise is so concentrated in the few people who are kind of on that bleeding edge, it's hard for regulators to kind of get ahead of it.
Yeah. And you raised some good points too, that, these technological advances in something especially like AI don't know borders, right?
No, they do not.
We're seeing the EU already act on this at the end of last year. Obviously, everyone's heard about kind of our chips competition with China and where we're going to go with this. And so Congress has a lot, not only to get up to speed on their own, but how do they keep up with where the rest of the world is regulating this and balance our leadership innovation with
completely
protocols in place.
Well, and the way that policy, we ask policymakers every year, what are your top priorities? And you could even see in the way they're thinking about it, every one of their top priorities is attached back to technology in some capacity. So they're talking about the economy as a top priority, shocker. But, that's tech is a driving part of the economy. The national security is a top 5 priority. Well, that is very embedded in the idea of cybersecurity and sort of how these technologies play out. The environment, talking about AVs and EVs and technological advancements. So it's a real challenge and a through line, I think, through everything that people are thinking about.
Yeah, I wanted to get back to that, especially because we are in an election year. I mean, cybersecurity popped up as a big issue for policymakers. I imagine, but educate me if I'm wrong, some of that is both, you mentioned Ukraine, the kind of geopolitical risks we're seeing in the world. There's obviously, we've already seen AI doctored, Biden videos and the campaign trail, and I'm sure we'll see a lot more. How concerned are policymakers about that aspect of it?
What we were hearing is that they're actually pretty concerned. I think the idea of AI and disinformation, are very much tied together, and that comes with not just the election stuff, but when we talk to them about what they want to see in advocacy materials too, it comes out in that lens as well. But there's concerns about AI being used to skew voters in one direction or another to get them to not vote at all. I think that happened with the Biden robocall recently, where they were, and so it's already happening, and I think that makes it that much harder when the people who need to regulate it don't really know how to regulate it, especially in an election year. There's also a lot of general concern about election infrastructure and protecting the workers and the volunteers as they're trying to do their jobs on those days, and the concern is expressed. The solution has not been. I think it's one of those things that they all know is a problem, but they don't really know what to do about it.
Yeah. Are they looking for industry to help solve it and take a piece of it, or
I think
to provide data to help them make their decision?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think they want that guidance from industry in order to be able to, there is a consensus that action is needed, right? But they can't do that without the proper information. So they want, I think, tech companies to take that initiative and take that lead and offer them up the information so that they have that stuff at their disposal and they can kind of go in and then make the choices that they need to make. And I think, just as a little bit of a tangent, but another thing that we were seeing a lot of commentary on is the fact that they want to create that regulatory structure without sort of putting a cap on innovation and preventing the speed of this stuff from, I don't really think anyone can stop the speed of it, but they don't want to slow down that process and prevent people from being able to do some really exciting things. So it's, they're balancing that line with it as well.
This was my next question for all of you. There is, it's a perfect segue. There is this, we talked a little bit about this international competitiveness, and we want U.S. companies to be innovating. Also coming out of COVID, we want to make sure they've kind of secured their supply chain and their workers so they can continue to compete both at home and abroad. I assume, but you will all educate me, that's top of mind for policymakers. At the same time, they have to kind of bring this regulation to it. So how does all that interconnectedness, come through in the research?
This is where some of the comparative policy analysis that we're able to do between the US and EU research is really quite fascinating, because it really does reveal those tensions that are happening around interconnectedness and competitiveness and maintaining that within the geographical boundaries, right? You see both the US and the EU push for autonomy within their regions. The other side of that coin, though, is maintaining innovation and maintaining relationships broadly between the two regions. In our EU research, what we often hear policymakers mention is the Inflation Reduction Act, right? And how the IRA is incentivizing onshoring to the US, EU companies. And ultimately, what that reveals is the policy mechanisms between these two regions and how quickly and effectively they can mobilize things like subsidies to create incentives for these companies. So in that situation, the U.S. has a bit more agility than the EU. And so questions that we're thinking about with this upcoming cohort of research with both regions is how the elections is going to create more incentives for programs that allow organizations to maintain that competitive edge and allow for both these regions to be the home for that.
Well, Sehare, it's interesting too, because, and speaking to this idea of trade-offs, one of the things that is a through line that I don't think we've talked about yet is this idea of how all these tie up together in workforce.
That's a good point.
And that, people care about the competitiveness in their communities, and they care about this sort of things, but they're also really worried about, the IRA is a jobs act in many capacities. It's about bringing kind of some of these good middle class jobs historically back to the United States. It's also, but at the same time, has a countervailing thing of AI also fundamentally is going to change our workforce. I mean, we've seen it, even if you look at, historical manufacturing, the advent of robotics really sort of decimated. It's not just the fact that things are being offshored, it's the fact that it's more efficient to do things with less people. AI is bringing that into office buildings now.
Right, the white collar jobs.
The white collar jobs. Yeah. I mean, someone's coming for my job. I don't have to read something. I can make ChatGPT do it. But I think that's
also read more now. That's all that means.
Yes, exactly. I'm really good at reading summaries instead of raw data. And but all to say that that's part of the challenge too, is that I think a lot of these kind of this interconnectedness is that everyone's thinking about not just how do I protect my country's economy, but how do I protect the workforce, and how do I protect the job opportunities of my citizens and my constituents and everything, both in the United States and I guess globally as well.
And I think just to kind of piggyback off of that, one of the things that came out of COVID was also this sort of lens of how do we protect American people's resources and the economy here when things shut down abroad, which kind of speaks to again why there's a lot of this conversation, which is actually getting bipartisan support, which is a nice thing to see, that they're agreeing on the idea of bringing more things back to just sort of. I think before COVID, that interdependence was a little bit less of an issue. But now when we saw how things shut down after, just around the world, it's definitely been something that's been more top of mind in trying to make sure and ensure that stability and security just in case. It's a little bit more proactive now, I think, the conversation.
Yeah, we could go really deep on this. But before we run out of time, I want to get to my favorite part of the report, which is the advocacy section, because not to get on my stool here a little bit, but I feel like Washington too much just runs the same old playbook over and over and over again. And there's some really good insights into how organizations are breaking through, how to effectively communicate with policymakers, and that does evolve over time, whether it's AI, whether it's post-COVID. So maybe just for the final few minutes, what are you guys seeing in terms of what's really standing out to help policymakers?
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of the tried and true stuff of be proactive, build that relationship before the fire breaks out, right? Be concise, be localized, show how this impacts their constituents or interests in that locality. But there's some really interesting examples, or really fun examples, I think, that come through in the research as well of what has actual stickiness over time, right? There's the site visits is one that comes up even if years after it has occurred. Interactions with senior leadership has come up. My favorite example, though, and I will try to be vague here to protect the client, but they consistently every year drop off a piece of swag that is representative of the company. And when they do that, they've noticed that it's being collected year over year. It has a level of stickiness and it has a level of reputation building that taps into other sensory capabilities that a one-pager just can't, right? So there are other examples of really sticky ways to stay top of mind that we've heard in the research. The last thing I'll add there, too, is that be thoughtful about the terminology and who you're speaking with, because the terminology can be used in a way that closes the door before you even get to start the conversation.
Sure. Yeah, it's true. And you're constantly re-educating, as the Hill obviously has a ton of turnover. But Emily, you've seen some certain organizations like really kind of pop out with policymakers. What are they doing that get your attention?
Yeah. I think that to Sehare's point, it's if you can do having an event or some kind of activation thing is actually really does make a big difference. There are all sorts of things they think we get into in the Washington Insights review about like what makes that worthwhile. But I think that it's that taking something and really personalizing it and tailoring it to who you're trying to reach. Right. I think we take like AI and tech as an example. We hear stories in the several years I've been involved in this research of people who are like, I went to an offsite and they showed me how to use it. I sat in an autonomous vehicle. They showed me like how to play with this piece of consumer electronics. And I sort of understood it, and I sort of got that tactile, like really cool experience. I think those companies were able to take what they're doing, even if you're not in a local district, and able to localize it, which is obviously, I think every advocate knows that's tell me how many jobs are in my town in Kentucky or right. Idaho. But being able to have that kind of memorable experience in terms of really kind of educate in a way that is not patronizing, is not self-serving, but is really saying I'm trying to capacity build, is really sticky. I mean, we hear people talk about specific instances, again, like years later, and doing it with stories too. I mean, I think one thing, going back to Natalie's comment about COVID, every year we hear, for the last 3 years, we've heard a story about, have you heard about these little girls who during COVID didn't have internet and they had to go to insert fast food chain? It's been McDonald's, it's been Taco Bell, it's been KFC, it's been all of them, and they have to do that. And so these kind of images really stick in people's minds, and organizations that are able to kind of create those stories and those kind of like powerful images are really able to kind of be memorable in a slew of information.
Yeah, it's a good point. We have a very simple messaging rule around here of show and tell. Like you can give, people want data. Your research shows that. They want that. But that hands-on experience where you get to show them something, they get to experience it. I won't name names, but years ago I helped a beer company, and they'd literally bring members to go like brew their own beer talk about core memories. Like that sticks with policymakers forever. Oh, completely. And the site visit thing too. I mean, we've had, I would say, again, I try not to name names, but we've had even like reputationally challenged, companies that have gone through real actual scandals get really positive accolades for showing people their facilities. I mean, which is in a showing like, yes, this is what you read about us in the news, and you might not like what you read about us in the news, but here is John Doe who works in our factory, and here is John Doe's colleague who does the accounting, and here's how here's what we've invested in John and his colleagues' community. And that stuff is really powerful, and it really helps counteract. We see it actually in the qualitative that Sehare was talking about of like, here's like the story that I remember. We also see it in the quantitative of when we track folks' reputation and perceptions of organizations over time in DC, the companies we see that kind of surprise us, we're like, really?
they're doing pretty well. Often we'll hear in the qual, oh, well, they had these like really tactical things about showing folks what their value is independent of what the national narrative might be.
Well, it's like personalizing it by showing it's personal to the people that it impacts, right? So it's putting faces to an issue or to a cause, and I think that's kind of coming back to what the policymakers are talking about. Like that's something that has been consistent, but also I think they're kind of expressing more of a desire for that, where they want to do those site visits. They want to go out with the company and do deliveries. They want to be able to sit in a room with the people who are actually making decisions and get their perspectives and talk to them about the choices that they're making, because it's personal that way. You know?
And to be a conduit, we had some policymakers talk about the fact that what an organization can connect them with their constituents on issues. And like that's such I had not thought about it in that capacity, but they're like, oh yeah, if so-and-so wants to help me, set up an event where I get to come and talk to people that I might not be able to talk to otherwise. Like do some of that legwork, which is also, again, you can do it in district, you can do it in DC, but it's making those connections are really powerful.
Bringing those people here.
I also think it's something to be said, because I feel like people on the Hill, like in these agencies, they're constantly being handed papers, right? So anytime that they can have an experience that goes along with the information that they're being given, it makes it just that much more memorable. To kind of backtrack to what Sehare was saying about relationship building, that's something that we've consistently seen as a theme in the years that I've been working on in the Washington Insights Review. And it's one of those things where, they don't want an email once in a blue moon just being like, hey, how's it going? When you can really put that touch out there and make it something consistent, make it something that you're known for, like you were talking about, swag or whatever it is, you build a relationship that has a foundation to it. They're much more likely to open the email out of the 1,000 they received that day.
Yeah. It's a good point. Unfortunately, we have to leave it there, but certainly more to come on all of this in future episodes. So Emily, Natalie, Sehare, thank you so much for joining us on What's at Stake today. We appreciate it.
Happy to be here.
Yeah,
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Brian. It was fun.
For our listeners, you can check out all of our episodes of What's at Stake by subscribing to the Penta podcast channel, wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us on X or Twitter at PentaGRP, LinkedIn at Penta Group. I'm your host, Bryan DeAngelis. As always, thanks for listening.